The high desert sun beat down on Silver Ridge with no mercy that day, painting long, sharp shadows across the dusty main street. Heat shimmered off the wood plank sidewalks, and the only sounds were the dry creak of windmill blades and the faint buzz of flies over at the livery. Everything else, laughter, chatter, the sound of boots and business, had vanished. Because Tex Bridger had come to town. A giant of a man, all in black, but for the brown, dust-covered hat that cast his face in shadow, strode down the center of Main Street like he owned it. His spurs rang out with each step, slow and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something terrible. 23 notches carved into the worn leather of his gun belt told the story no one dared say aloud. 23 men, 23 lives, and not a single apology. Inside the mercantile, Mrs. Patterson crouched behind the counter, her hands shaking as she whispered a prayer. 2 blocks down, Mr. Hawkins locked the doors to his general store with fumbling fingers. Across the street, Big Mike, who'd once wrestled a bear in the Dakota Hills, quietly slipped out the back of the saloon and vanished into the alley like a ghost. No one stayed in Tex Bridger's line of sight. No one except a 7-year-old girl in a faded blue dress. Rosie McKinnon stood in the middle of the street, bare feet in the dust, a small wooden horse clutched tight in her hand. Her chestnut hair was pulled into 2 neat braids that bounced slightly in the breeze, and her chin was lifted with the kind of quiet resolve no one had ever dared show the most feared man in 3 counties. Tex saw her and stopped. His boots halted with a crunch of gravel, and the silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. For a moment he thought maybe it was a mirage, some phantom of a happier life he used to know. But the child didn't vanish. She just stared back at him, her wide eyes steady, curious, and impossibly not afraid. The air crackled like lightning was coming, though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Rosie took a step closer. "You're Tex Bridger," she said, her voice clear as the church bell that hadn't rung in years. Tex's hand hovered near the handle of his revolver. "What's it to you?" "I'm not afraid of you." The words were so simple, so absolute, that Tex forgot how to breathe. From behind shuttered windows, people gasped. You could feel the town hold its collective breath. Sheriff Dalton sat frozen in his office, his hand on his gun, but his courage long gone. No one dared move, speak, or blink, not when death was staring a child in the face. Tex's voice dropped low, full of menace. "You should be." "Maybe," Rosie shrugged, "but I'm not." She held out the small wooden horse she'd carved herself. The toy was no more than 6 inches long, but it had a noble arch to its neck and delicate lines carved into the mane. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed it gently at his feet. "My daddy used to say, 'Hurt people,'" she said softly. "But he also said even the worst folks might still have good in them, if they remember how to look." Tex looked down at the toy, then at the child. He didn't know what to say. His mouth felt dry, his fingers twitched at his sides, the whole world tilted, like someone had kicked out the legs from under the life he'd built one bullet, one fear, one corpse at a time. "I don't want your toy," he muttered. Rosie smiled a little, that same lopsided grin her daddy used to give when he fixed things with just his hands and his heart. "That's okay. You don't have to keep it. I just wanted you to have something that wasn't fear." Then she turned around and walked away. Tex stood there, frozen, while her small feet padded through the dust and disappeared down Maple Street. Behind him, someone finally exhaled. Back at the McKinnon house, Helen yanked the door open before Rosie even reached the porch. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. She swept her daughter into her arms. "What were you thinking?" she gasped, clutching Rosie so tightly it hurt. I wasn't afraid, Mama. He looked so sad. Helen's mouth opened, then closed. She dropped to her knees, gripping Rosie's face in her hands. Sad men still kill, baby, especially ones like him. But he didn't hurt me. Helen pulled her daughter into her arms again, pressing her face into Rosie's braid. She didn't answer because she didn't trust her voice not to break. Across town, Tex stood motionless in front of the general store. The wooden horse still sat at his boots. He looked at it like it might bite him, like it might undo everything he'd built, everything he'd buried. He bent slowly, knees cracking, and picked it up. The wood was smooth, warm from the sun. It smelled faintly of pine and patience. Her hands had shaped it, hands that had no calluses yet, no blood on them. Just hope. That was what this toy was made of. Hope. He didn't know how long he stood there holding it. Tex rode out just before sundown. He said nothing to no one, just mounted up and disappeared into the dust like he always did. But this time, his saddlebags held something they'd never held before. A wooden horse carved by a child who wasn't afraid of him. That night, under a sky so clear the stars looked like broken glass scattered across black velvet, Tex sat alone by his fire. He drank his whiskey slower than usual. He didn't look at the gun resting on the saddle beside him. He looked instead at the little horse. He held it in his palm, ran his thumb over the grooves in the mane. He remembered how it felt to hold his daughter's hand, how it felt to carve toys by lantern light while Margaret hummed in the kitchen. He remembered who he was before the world burned, before Thomas Brennan became Tex Bridger. Why you? He whispered to the stars. Why'd you come back now? The stars didn't answer. They never did. But in the flicker of the firelight, the horse seemed almost to move, like it was alive in his hand, like it had something to say. Tex closed his hand around it and bowed his head. Maybe, he thought, the girl wasn't sent to make him feel anything. Maybe she was sent to remind him he still could. And deep in the night, while Silver Ridge slept behind its barricaded doors, the most feared man in the territory made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow he would ride back into that town, and this time he wouldn't just be passing through. The fire crackled in the quiet dark, painting orange flickers on the hardened lines of Tex Bridger's face. His wide shoulders hunched forward, the rawhide of his black vest creaking faintly with the movement. The desert wind tugged at the edge of his hat as he sat cross-legged beside the flames, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the small wooden horse balanced on his knee. It was nothing much, not by the standards of war trophies or gold coins or the stained pistols of dead men. But to Tex, no, not Tex, Thomas, it felt heavier than all the bullets he'd carried over the years. That little girl, standing in the middle of Silver Ridge like a cottonwood sapling, daring the storm, had undone something inside him with nothing but a carving knife and the kind of heart most people lost before they turned 10. Her voice echoed in his mind as clear as the desert sky. I'm not afraid of you. He'd heard grown men weep when they saw him coming, seen lawmen ride the other way. Hell, even the preacher in Laredo had refused to bury the last man Tex put in the ground. But this girl had walked right up to him, looked into the storm behind his eyes, and handed him a horse. Thomas turned it slowly in his palm, thumb brushing the grooves she'd carved in the mane. It was crude work, but there was care in every curve, love in every uneven edge, the kind of love he used to put into toys for his daughter. Lucy. His jaw tightened, breath catching in his throat. 20 years hadn't dulled the memory of her giggle or the way she'd press wildflowers into his pockets like gifts from the fairies she believed in. Margaret had called her his shadow, always trailing behind him with her tiny fists clenched in determination and wonder. And then one Tuesday morning they were both gone, burned out of the world by 5 men who'd taken everything and left behind nothing but ash and rage. Tex hadn't cried in 20 years, but now as the flames danced and the horse warmed in his hand, something wet stung at the corner of his eye. He blinked it away and poured another shot of whiskey. The burn steadied him. The man in the photograph, tucked deep in his saddlebag, clean-shaven, smiling, full of hope, felt like a stranger now. But Rosie McKinnon had looked at him like she saw that man, not the killer, not the ghost, the man. And that terrified him more than any gun ever had. By morning, the whiskey was gone, the fire nothing but cold embers. Thomas sat for a long time, letting the silence wrap around him like an old coat. Then he saddled his horse, tucked the wooden carving into his coat pocket, and turned toward Silver Ridge, not to collect fear, but to return something he hadn't known he'd lost. He didn't expect her to be waiting. But there she was, sitting on the edge of the boardwalk in front of the general store, swinging her legs like it was any normal day. She wore the same light blue dress, now dustier than before, and had a fistful of prairie flowers clutched in her hand, bright yellow, violet, and white. Her braids were slightly undone, and her cheeks were pink from the sun. Tex reined in his horse and dismounted slowly, every eye in town watching from behind lace curtains and half-closed shutters. Rosie stood and walked toward him like they had a standing appointment. "I picked these for you," she said, holding up the flowers. He stared at them like they were a riddle. "I don't take gifts," he said gruffly. She smiled again, that same damn smile. You didn't take the horse either. But you kept it." His breath caught. She knew. Somehow she knew. "I ain't earned flowers," he muttered, shifting his weight like a man not used to standing still. "Maybe not," she replied simply, "but sometimes people need things they don't think they deserve." He didn't know what to say to that. Then, before he could stop her, Rosie stepped forward and tucked the flowers into the loop of leather on his gun belt, right beside the handle of the same Colt that had ended so many lives. The color stood out against the black of his duster, vivid and innocent and absurd. "There," she said. "Now it's not so lonely down there." Tex couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He stared down at the flowers like they were made of fire. From the upstairs window of the saloon, Mrs. Patterson's mouth fell open. At the sheriff's office, Dalton lowered his coffee cup and muttered something under his breath that no one could quite hear. In the post office, old man Lyle whispered, "Well, I'll be damned." Because, for the first time in 2 decades, the monster they feared wasn't snarling or threatening or taking. He was receiving. From a child. Rosie stepped back and nodded, like they'd just finished a trade. "You don't have to be scary all the time, Mr. Tex," she said. "Sometimes it's okay to let folks see you." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. She gave him a little wave and skipped off toward the church, trailing dust and light like she didn't have a care in the world. Tex stood there in the middle of Main Street, flowers in his gun belt, the carved horse pressing against his chest beneath his coat, and for the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel like a man made of iron and fire. He felt like flesh and blood again, wounded, maybe, but breathing. That night, he didn't ride out of town. He made camp beneath the sycamore just outside the churchyard. Not because he was watching for danger, but because part of him was hoping she might come by in the morning, and he didn't want to miss her. And just before dawn, as the sky turned that soft pink that only shows up in quiet places, Tex Bridger realized something terrifying. He wanted to be worthy of the flowers she'd given him. The next time she handed him something made from kindness, he didn't want to flinch. And deep down, past all the scars and sins, he feared that the next time might not be a flower. It might be forgiveness. The rain came overnight, a slow, steady drizzle that turned the dust of Silver Ridge's main road into darkened earth. In the early morning light, the smell of wet timber drifted through Helen McKinnon's modest home at the edge of town. It was the kind of morning that made a woman linger with her coffee, thinking about things best left buried. Helen had been rummaging through the cedar chest in her bedroom, looking for Rosie's old rain boots, when her hand brushed something harder than cloth. She peeled back a stack of worn baby blankets and found an old leather folder, cracked and brittle at the edges. Inside lay a tarnished deputy marshal badge, and beside it, a folded letter yellowed with time. She sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing beneath her, and read, "To Deputy James McKinnon, for exemplary service and conduct during the Stanton Ridge uprising. Your courage preserved lives and upheld the law with dignity. With gratitude, Office of the Regional Command, Dakota Territories." Her eyes welled up. It wasn't just the words, it was the sudden weight of everything James had carried that she had never fully understood. He wasn't just her husband. He was someone this land had trusted, and now he was just a name etched into a grave marker behind the chapel. Rosie peeked through the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her brown curls wild and tangled. "Morning, Mama," she mumbled. Helen quickly wiped her cheek and folded the letter. "Morning, sugar. Go wash up now." But Rosie had spotted the badge. She tiptoed closer. "Was that Papa's?" Helen nodded. "He wore it back when he helped keep this place safe." Rosie's fingers hovered above the metal like it might burn her. "Tex knew Papa," she said. Helen looked up sharply. "Rosie, what are you talking about?" "He told me yesterday," said Papa, "once pulled him out of a creek when he was bleeding bad. Called him a fool and made him promise not to die." Helen blinked, mouth parting. "Tex said that? Well, I asked him if he ever got saved by an angel, and he said maybe once, a long time ago. And then he got real quiet." She looked up with those big, curious eyes of hers. "I think he's sad, Mama." "Real sad." Helen exhaled slowly, heart stirring with both fear and something more complicated. "Baby, folks like Tex Bridger don't have room in their life for feelings. Not the kind that lasts." But Rosie only smiled. "I call him Mr. Thomas now. He don't seem to mind out at the edge of town, Tex. Or rather, the man once known as Thomas Brennan had just finished shoeing his horse under the gray skies. He was quiet, his thick hands roughened by labor, the kind that stays in the muscle long after the job's done. The little wooden horse Rosie gave him was still tied to the saddle horn with a scrap of red ribbon. Later that afternoon, Rosie came walking down the muddy lane, her boots too big and slipping at the heel. In her arms, she carried a warm loaf, wrapped in cloth, and a drawing she'd made. Her and Tex, standing beside a campfire, smiling under stars. Tex was sitting on the porch of his small cabin when she arrived. She didn't knock, just climbed right up and held out the bundle. "Brought you bread, Mr. Thomas." "Mama made it." "I drew something too." Tex took the drawing with slow fingers, his brows pulling together like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. "That you and me?" he asked quietly. Rosie nodded. "That's my favorite part. You smiling." He looked at it for a long while, longer than a man should for a child's drawing. Then he folded it and placed it gently in his coat pocket. She sat beside him, swinging her legs. "Can I ask you something?" she said, staring out at the hills. "Suppose you can." "Did you have a daughter?" Tex's jaw twitched. "I did. Her name was Lucy. She was 6 when she passed." Rosie didn't say sorry like other people did. She just turned and placed her hand on his. "Maybe Lucy sent me to remind you how to be a daddy." Something cracked deep inside him, something he'd spent years burying under whiskey, fights, and silence. His hand trembled slightly under hers. "You don't know what kind of man I am, little one," he whispered. Rosie smiled gently. I know the kind who let a flower stay on his gun belt. Tex glanced down. The tiny wildflower she'd pinned days ago was still there, pressed against the worn leather. That evening, Helen watched from the distance as her daughter walked home beside the man the whole town still feared. But she wasn't afraid. Not one bit. Inside the McKinnon home, Helen returned to the cedar chest and placed James's badge on the mantel. For the first time in years, she felt something in the air shift. Like maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. Out in the hills beyond town, under the stars, Tex lit a lantern and stared into the flame. He opened an old saddlebag and pulled out a folded photograph. His wife, Abigail. His daughter, Lucy. A life gone. He looked up at the wooden horse tied to the saddle horn, and for the first time in 20 years, the giant cowboy whispered a prayer. But in the distance, under the cover of night, a rider galloped toward Silver Ridge. He carried news. And it wasn't the kind that came with peace. It was a morning wrapped in gold and dust, with the wind dragging the scent of gun oil and wild sage down from the canyon. At the edge of Silver Ridge, a line of riders crested the hills like a storm brewing over calm plains. 11 men, weather-beaten and mean-eyed, their horses restless beneath them, snorted and kicked at the dry earth. At their center rode a man in a coal-black coat and a wide hat that shadowed a face both cruel and familiar. Black Jack Crenshaw had come back. Tex was sharpening a fence post behind the church when he felt it first. Not heard. Felt. A cold, crawling sensation in his gut, like a hound growling just beneath the skin. He dropped the draw knife, turned slowly, and looked toward the ridgeline. His breath caught. Time did a cruel thing in that moment. It didn't slow, it froze. And in that stillness, memories bled through. 20 years. 20 years since he'd knelt beside a burning wagon, clutching the broken bodies of his wife and little girl. 20 years since Black Jack Crenshaw and his crew had come laughing through the Texas dust, drunk on blood and power, leaving nothing but ashes behind. Tex didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He just stared, jaw tight, chest rising with the weight of everything buried. Rosie came skipping from the livery, arms full of carrots, waving at him like nothing had changed. "Mr. Thomas, can you help me feed Daisy? She likes when you do the silly voice." Tex blinked hard. "Go inside, Rosie." Now, the tone of his voice stopped her in her tracks. She looked up, confused. "What's wrong?" "Just go. Please." She obeyed, slowly, her boots crunching against the dry path, head tilted in worry. She glanced back once, saw him reach under his duster for the weapon strapped low to his thigh, and her young face twisted in fear. By noon, the town had caught wind of the strangers. Sheriff Burt emerged from the jailhouse, pale and already sweating. "Tex, you seeing what I'm seeing?" "I see ghosts," Tex muttered. The sheriff gave a nervous chuckle. "Hell, I thought Black Jack Crenshaw was dead." "He should be." The sheriff leaned in, voice dropping. "You gonna run again?" Tex turned sharply, eyes flashing like steel dragged over stone. "That little girl out there made me a man again, Bert. I ain't leaving her behind." "You sure?" "Black Jack's got a reputation even the Pinkertons won't chase anymore. Man's killed more people than winter fever." Tex looked toward the general store where Rosie and her mother were hiding. He nodded slowly. "All the more reason he don't get to ride out of here." That evening, Black Jack's gang settled on the outskirts, not entering town, but close enough to choke it. They set up camp by the old sawmill, posted lookouts, and lit fires like they owned the land. No one dared ride out to greet them. Tex spent the night leaning against the post outside Helen's boarding house, Henry rifle across his lap. He didn't move when Helen stepped out, arms folded, eyes hard. "You're staying," she said. Yeah. You didn't stay last time, did you? Tex met her stare. No. I ran. Helen looked toward the ridgeline where faint firelight danced. If you're gonna be a father to Rosie, even just in spirit, don't run this time. I'm not. Inside, Rosie was asleep with the wooden horse in her arms, her curls spread across the pillow like sun-warmed straw. Tex stepped in quietly and placed something beside the toy, a bullet he'd carved her name into with the tip of his knife. A promise. A prayer. Outside, a figure moved in the dark. Slim. Quick. Too quiet for a townsman. One of Crenshaw's scouts, slinking through alleys, mapping the streets, watching who stayed where. Tex saw him from the corner of his eye but didn't draw. Not yet. Let them believe he was just another tired old man on a bench. Blackjack wasn't just passing through. He was circling, like a wolf sniffing for weakness. And Tex Brennan, the ghost who once rode with Texas Rangers, wasn't going to let that happen again. He wasn't just staying, he was waiting. And from the way Blackjack had smiled atop that horse, Blackjack was waiting too, which meant someone else had already tipped him off. Someone from Silver Ridge, someone inside. The morning sun stretched gold across Silver Ridge, catching on dust motes that floated through the church windows like drifting prayers. Helen stood in the doorway of the chapel, arms crossed, watching Rosie march down the aisle with purpose, clutching something wrapped in an old handkerchief. Her little boots thudded softly on the worn floorboards. Tex Thomas stood near the front, hammering the last nail into a crooked bench he'd been repairing since dawn. He didn't look up until he heard her voice. "Mr. Thomas," Rosie said with a wide grin, "I think this belongs to you." She unwrapped the cloth with the care of someone holding something sacred. Inside lay the tarnished silver badge of Deputy James McKinnon. The initials J.M. were etched faintly on the back. The tin star was worn, but it still caught the morning light like it remembered justice. Tex stared at it. Didn't move. Just looked. His hands still gripped around the hammer like it had become a part of him. "I found it in Daddy's box," Rosie explained, her voice softening. "Mama kept it after he died. But I think he'd want you to have it now." Helen had followed her daughter in, but kept a few paces behind, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes shifted between the badge and Tex's face, searching for the wrong kind of reaction. But what she saw wasn't pride or false humility. It was something closer to fear. Tex finally spoke, his voice cracked like dry wood. "I don't deserve that." Rosie tilted her head. "You do now." He looked at her, and something in those hazel eyes of hers held him steady. Like she wasn't offering forgiveness, she was offering faith. And it scared him more than any pistol ever could. Helen cleared her throat. "Rosie, maybe you shouldn't push him. He has his reasons." Tex turned to Helen then, and in that glance, something unspoken passed between them. The weeks of guarded distance, of wary sidelong looks, all seemed to narrow into this one moment. "I was there," he said, "that day, when it happened." Helen's eyes flickered. "You mean the robbery?" He nodded. "Blackjack's gang hit a mail wagon outside Pueblo. James and I were the first to respond. We split off. I didn't follow protocol. Thought I could flank them. By the time I got back, he was already gone." The chapel was quiet now, heavy with memory. Even Rosie felt the air shift. Helen's shoulders lowered, the tightness around her eyes softened. "You tried," she said after a long pause. "You came back. That's more than most would have done." Tex looked down at the badge, now resting in his calloused palm. The weight of it wasn't just metal. It was history. It was failure. It was hope. He pinned it to his shirt. The worn leather vest he wore every day had a small notch left by an old bullet scar, but now the badge sat over his heart. "I ain't no lawman," he murmured. "You don't need to be," Helen replied, her voice steadier now. "You just need to be decent and brave." He exhaled, slow. "Those two things don't come easy." "They do," Rosie said, "if someone believes you can be both." Later that day, word spread around Silver Ridge. Old Man Harris saw Tex riding past the dry goods store with the badge on. Miss Corley from the dress shop called it a miracle. Even Pastor Dale nodded respectfully when Tex rode by the church again that evening. He hadn't seen the town look at him like that in years. By nightfall, men were showing up at the chapel not to pray, but to ask what needed fixing. Fences, a barn door. Someone brought a crate of nails. Another handed over a box of ammunition with a grunt and a "figured you might need this." The people weren't just tolerating Tex now. They were rallying behind him. And Helen. She baked. Not much, just a peach cobbler. She said it was for the pastor, but she left it on Tex's stoop, warm and wrapped in a towel. She didn't wait for thanks. That night, Tex sat alone by the fire, badge glinting in the low light. He held a picture of Lucy, faded and cracked, and Rosie's drawing from 2 days ago, a crayon sketch of Mr. Thomas and Rosie and her new horse. He set them side by side on the table, side by side like past and present. Then came a knock at the door. Tex stiffened, hand reaching instinctively toward the rifle propped beside the chair. Another knock, slower this time. When he opened it, he saw two things, a candlelit sky behind a man in a dusty coat and the hard, familiar eyes of Sheriff Morgan standing at the threshold. "We need to talk," the sheriff said. Tex stared at him, jaw tight. "About what?" Sheriff Morgan shifted his weight. "Black Jack Crenshaw just robbed the Wells Fargo depot out in Buckhorn. 3 dead. They're headed this way." Tex didn't flinch. Just stepped back inside, grabbed his hat, and slung the rifle across his shoulder. Then he looked the sheriff square in the eye. "Let's finish what should have been finished 20 years ago." The letter arrived before sunrise, shoved under the swinging doors of the Silver Ridge Saloon. Its seal was nothing more than a blackened thumbprint smeared across cheap paper. Tex unfolded it with calloused fingers, the message scrawled in a hand as jagged as Crenshaw's soul. "You got 1 week. When we come back, we finish what we started. I'll burn your town like I burned your home. You die last." Crenshaw Tex stood there in the quiet saloon, the morning chill creeping up his spine, the past and present twisting together like barbed wire. He handed the letter to Helen without a word. Her eyes scanned the threat, then lifted to meet his. No scream, no tears. Just a quiet breath, like someone bracing for winter. "What are you gonna do?" she asked. Tex looked out the window. The streets were empty. The town had gone soft after years of peace, lulled into thinking it was forgotten by the fire that once scorched its edges. But fire remembers. "I'll talk to them," he said, "all of them." By mid-morning, the bell above the chapel rang, not for a sermon, but for survival. The pews were filled with folks who once crossed to the other side of the street when Tex passed by. Men who whispered about his past, women who clutched their children tighter. They stared at him now, wary, half ready to bolt at the first bad word. He didn't blame them. Tex stood near the altar, his voice low but steady. "I know what I was," he began, "and I know what's comin'. Black Jack Crenshaw ain't a man who leaves things half done. He's comin' here to finish what he started, and this town's in the way." Someone near the back shifted nervously. "Why not just leave, Tex? Take the girl and go." Rosie stepped forward from the shadows beside the pulpit. Her hair was pulled into two uneven braids, her boots scuffed, her cheeks streaked with dust, but her eyes burned like oil lanterns. "If I'm not afraid," she said, her voice ringing through the chapel, "then you don't have to be either." A silence fell so complete you could hear the creek outside swallowing the wind. Then old Miss Emery, who once scolded Tex for tying his horse too close to her hydrangeas, stood. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. "I'll watch the rooftops," she said. "Ain't held a rifle since the war, but my aim's still true." One by one, the others rose. Sam Tiller, the blacksmith, lifted a hammer in the air. Clara Joe, who ran the bakery, offered to boil pitch for the barricades. Even the judge, once Tex's harshest critic, pledged his stable for the wounded, just in case. They trained in the open field behind the church. Tex showed them how to brace a rifle, how to breathe before a shot, how to wait for the whites of a man's eyes before pulling the trigger. Rosie shadowed his every move, mimicking the stance, the focus, the patience. When a rusted tin can flew from her first shot, a cheer rose that shook the leaves off nearby trees. They built barricades from scrap wood and broken wagons, stacked crates of rock salt and sandbags near alleyways, carved firing lanes across the main road. Smoke from Helen's kitchen drifted out over the training yard as she brought biscuits and black coffee, wearing an apron dusted with flour, and something fiercer than fear resolve. At sundown, Tex stood atop the old gallows platform in the center of town. It hadn't been used in 15 years, but he remembered every creak of its boards. Once a place of punishment, now it would be the lookout tower for a second chance. "We're not soldiers," someone muttered beside him. "No," Tex replied. "We're better. We're people who learned how to live again, and we ain't about to lose that to ghosts." That night, as lanterns glowed in every window, Rosie found Tex outside the jailhouse, where he kept watch alone. "You think we can win?" she asked. Tex didn't answer right away. He looked toward the distant hills where the black edge of trouble was already curling against the horizon. "I don't know," he said, "but for the first time in 20 years, I know I ain't alone." Just then, a sound cracked through the dark. Not a gunshot. A scream. It came from the northern ridge, and it was followed by silence too deep for coyotes. Tex grabbed his rifle, heart pounding. Rosie didn't wait for permission, she followed him. By the time they reached the ridge, the sheriff's old horse lay slain, throat slit clean, and tied to its saddle horn was another letter. This time it was addressed not to Tex, but to Rosie. The morning came heavy and dry, the sky a washed-out canvas of gray above Silver Ridge. You could feel it in the dirt, in the hush that draped itself over the town. No birdsong, no dogs barking, just the sound of nails being driven into barricades and shutters creaking closed. Every porch was a bunker, every window a lookout. This wasn't a town anymore. It was a line in the sand. Tex stood in the center of Main Street, arms folded, watching the horizon. He hadn't slept, neither had Helen, neither had Rosie. He wore his old deputy badge now, tarnished and crooked on his vest, but not hidden anymore. It wasn't about rank, it was about standing for something. Crenshaw's letter was still folded in Tex's pocket. The ink smudged, but the words clear. "I'm coming. You and that little girl are going first. Then I burn what's left." They didn't have numbers, but they had heart, and sometimes that's louder than bullets. Helen adjusted the bandage on Tex's shoulder from yesterday's training accident, her hands trembling. "You don't have to do this, Tex." "I do. If I run again, I ain't the man Rosie thinks I am, or the man you hope I might be." He turned to see Rosie perched atop the church steps, arms crossed like she was 40, not 9. She'd refused to leave with the other kids. Said someone needed to keep the grown-ups brave. Now she stood in a homemade sash that read, Deputy in Training, one hand clutching a white flag painted with the image of a carved wooden horse, the same one Tex had whittled her weeks ago. They heard the rumble first. Hooves, then dust, then the echo of laughter, cold and cocky. Crenshaw's gang rode in like a storm, kicking up gravel and chewing up air. They didn't ride in columns. They rode like wolves, spread out, loud. 20 men at least. Some wore stolen army coats. Others had bandanas pulled tight around their faces. Crenshaw himself came dead center, coat flapping behind him like wings. His scarred face lit up the moment he saw Tex. "Well, look what crawled out of the grave," Crenshaw shouted. "I figured you'd skip town." "But I see you brought a welcoming party." Tex didn't flinch. "This town's not yours anymore." The first shot cracked the silence like lightning. Nobody knew who fired, but once it started, it all exploded. Bullets ripped through crates and barrels, windows shattered, smoke billowed. The church bell rang without a hand on the rope struck by a bullet that ricocheted from the saloon sign. Tex moved like a man possessed, ducking and rolling behind wagons, barking orders to townsfolk who just 2 weeks ago wouldn't look him in the eye. Helen and the preacher guarded the western alley with hunting rifles. Old man Gibbs, who hadn't lifted a shovel in years, smashed a gang member's knee with a fence post. One of the school teachers hit another with a frying pan from her window. Tex tackled a man who tried to torch the grain store, wrenching the torch from his hand and slamming him into the dirt. Then came the twist. A shot rang out from the North Ridge, sharp, measured, military. Everyone froze. From the tree line, a figure stepped forward, coat faded but clean, badge dull but still pinned. Sheriff Dalton, the real sheriff, gone for 15 years. Thought dead. He lifted his rifle. Thought it was time to stop hiding. Dalton fired. The bullet took down Crenshaw's second-in-command. Clean shot. No mercy. The tide shifted. Crenshaw turned, eyes burning. He raised his revolver, aimed it not at Tex but at Rosie, who had wandered into the open, holding her little flag high, trying to stop the bloodshed. "No!" Tex shouted. "Rosie, get down!" But she didn't. She held that flag with both hands and shouted, "Stop fighting! Just stop!" The gun went off. Tex moved faster than anyone thought he could. His body collided with hers midair, wrapping her in both arms as they hit the ground hard. Pain bloomed in his side. The bullet had found him, but Rosie was safe. The townspeople saw it all. They saw Tex bleed to save a child who once feared his shadow. They saw Crenshaw reload, smirking, thinking this was over. They saw something else, too. Rosie didn't cry. She stood up, knees scraped, face smeared with dust, and shouted, "He saved me! Don't let it be for nothing!" Crenshaw's smirk faded, because this time it wasn't just one man standing against him. It was an entire town, and they were done being afraid. The smoke hadn't even cleared from the street when Crenshaw stepped over the bodies of his own men. His coat flapped behind him like a black wing, and his eyes were locked on the little girl with the white flag in her hand. Rosie stood in the center of Main Street, her boots planted firm in the dirt, the wooden horse emblem stitched into the makeshift flag fluttering beside her. Her eyes, wide and trembling, met Crenshaw's without blinking. Behind her, townsfolk shouted, scrambled, pulled her name from their throats like a prayer. But she didn't move. Crenshaw raised his revolver slowly. His breath was even, controlled, the kind of calm that only monsters knew how to wear like a second skin. Tex, bleeding, barely conscious, lay slumped behind a broken wagon wheel. His vision swam in and out, but the second Crenshaw lifted that gun, something ancient inside him surged to life. He pushed off the ground, his boots dragging, each step driven by a single purpose. Rosie. The bullet rang out. Tex moved. It hit him square in the chest, knocking him backward. Rosie gasped, her voice cracking as she dropped to her knees beside him. "No!" she cried, pressing her hands against the spreading red on his shirt. "You promised you wouldn't leave me." Tex coughed, blood threading down his beard, and reached up to brush a curl from her forehead. His hand trembled, rough but gentle. "I ain't," he rasped. "I'm right here." Crenshaw took another step forward, cocking his weapon for the kill shot. His smile was the kind that chilled bone. "Should have stayed dead, Tex." But Tex's eyes didn't leave Rosie. He tightened his grip on the iron in his hand. With one last breath, one final flicker of strength, he lifted the revolver. The shot cracked like thunder across the square. Crenshaw stumbled, stared down at the hole torn through his chest, then collapsed into the dust without a sound. The silence that followed was unnatural. No wind, no shouts, just the soft rise and fall of Rosie's sobs and Tex's shallow breathing. The church bell rang, one single rusty clang, then another. The town's heartbeat silent for 20 years was alive again. Sheriff Dalton knelt beside them, his eyes wet. Others followed. Men who once feared Tex's shadow now surrounded him like kin. Doc Henry was already shouting orders, but it was clear the odds weren't good. Tex was fading. Rosie pressed her forehead to his. "Please don't go," he smiled, blood on his teeth. "You're my brave little friend." The bell kept ringing. Above the rooftops, the sun broke through the smoke, casting golden light on the bodies, the bullet holes, the cracked windows, and the girl holding the man who gave everything for her. Tex's hand slipped from hers. The whole town wept. But in the hush that followed, Rosie stood again. She picked up the flag, she faced the crowd, and she didn't cry anymore. Down the ridge, a distant dust cloud rose. Another rider was coming, and he carried news that would change everything. The first thing Tex saw when he opened his eyes was the color blue sky blue, like a spring morning. It took a moment to realize it wasn't the sky itself, but Rosie's eyes hovering over him, wide with hope and ringed with sleep. "You came back," she whispered. Tex tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. All he managed was a slight nod, the smallest flicker of a smile on lips that tasted of blood and dust. His chest ached like hell, wrapped tight in linen and stitched like an old saddlebag. But pain meant he was still alive, and that was more than he'd expected. "You slept for 3 days," said Doc Henry from the corner, "but damned if you didn't keep fighting in your sleep." The room was warm, wooden walls, patched roof, a fire humming soft in the hearth. It wasn't the bunkhouse he remembered, nor the abandoned saloon. It was someone's home. Helen's. She stepped in, carrying a bowl of broth, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. She looked tired but soft around the eyes in a way that made something shift in Tex's chest. He blinked. "This? Yours?" She smiled. "Now it's yours, too. For however long you stay," Tex looked from her to Rosie and back again. Something unspoken passed between the three of them. Not a promise, not yet, but something close. A thread being knotted. The days passed in a slow rhythm, stitched together by the sound of hammering and children's laughter. The town didn't just return to life, it remade itself. The church, once boarded up and shadowed by shame, was cleaned and repainted. The schoolhouse, its roof caved in from 2 decades of storms, now stood proudly with a new bell Rosie got to ring every morning. Fences were mended, porches rebuilt, lawns swept clean of years of silence. Tex walked with a limp, his side wrapped in bandages, but his hands found work quickly. Lifting beams, driving nails, hauling stones. No one told him to. No one needed to. Helen was there beside him most days. She didn't say much, but every time she handed him a nail or straightened a board he was holding, He saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. Not fear, not sorrow, belief. Rosie, meanwhile, had appointed herself deputy in training. She wore a tin star Dalton had made for her out of an old badge and a rope for a belt. She patrolled the streets with all the seriousness a 9-year-old could muster. When a scuffle broke out near the general store over a bent horseshoe, she stepped between two grown men and declared, "This is a town of second chances. So go cool off or I'll deputize Miss Helen and let her do the whoopin'." They laughed. Then they listened. People started coming from other towns. They'd heard the stories about the outlaw who saved a child, the sheriff who stood up to corruption, the town that didn't let bitterness rot its bones. A preacher from Dry Creek brought a stained glass window for the church. A teacher from Butte offered to help with the school. A carpenter from farther east asked to build homes for those starting over. Someone painted a sign over the livery stable. It read, "Silver Ridge, the town that forgave." Tex stared at it a long while. "You hate it?" Helen asked, brushing dust from her skirt. "No," he said softly. "I just never thought forgiveness had a street address." Rosie tugged his sleeve. "Now it does." One evening, Tex sat alone on the chapel steps, watching the sun dip behind the hills. His hands were calloused again. His heart still held scars, but the weight he'd carried 20 years of being hated, feared, forgotten, felt lighter somehow. Helen sat beside him. "You gonna stay?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He just looked out at the street, at Rosie helping Miss Clara close shop, at the church bell glowing gold in the fading light, at the town that had once wished him gone, now carrying him forward. "I think I already did," he said. That night, beneath a blanket of stars, a rider reached the edge of town. His horse was lathered. His face was tight with urgency. He carried news from the state capitol, about land deeds, about a railroad, and about an old name from Texas past, one that hadn't died in the dust like they all thought. Sunlight poured over Silver Ridge like a benediction. It was the first time in 20 years that the church bell rang, not for a funeral, not for a warning, but for celebration. Its rich, slow chime echoed down Main Street as ribbons of golden dust danced in the air. Wooden storefronts were polished. A freshly painted banner stretched across the front of the church. "Welcome to Silver Ridge, a community of hope." Children ran with paper flags. Old-timers who'd once sat with rifles by their porches now leaned on canes, holding lemonade. For the first time in a generation, folks weren't whispering about the past. They were talking about the future. Tex stood at the center of it all, no longer just Tex. His full name had returned to him like a lost coat he thought burned long ago. Thomas Bridger. The town had insisted he wear the badge, though no governor had signed off. No lawman had ridden in to deputize him. Rosie had pinned it herself, high on his chest, her little hands trembling just a bit with pride. He wore the same old brown hat, now reshaped and brushed clean. His vest had been stitched by Mrs. Adler, who swore more than once she'd never lay eyes on him again. Yet there she stood now, wiping tears from her cheek and adjusting his collar like a mother sending her son to church. "You nervous?" Rosie asked, squinting up at him. Tex smirked. "Only 'cause you're staring at me like I'm about to give a sermon." "You're the biggest man in this town," she said matter-of-factly. "You don't gotta preach." "Just stand there." Helen stepped onto the church steps, dressed in white, with her hair pulled back tight but soft at the edges. She'd spent the last weeks organizing everything: flowers, food, even seating charts for a town that used to sit apart out of fear. Today, no one sat apart. As Helen passed him, she paused and looked up at Tex. "You clean up nice," she said with a smile. "Still a monster?" he asked gently, the old weight teasing his voice. She shook her head. Just a man. And maybe the best one Rosie could have found. Tex swallowed hard. It was still strange the way people looked at him now, not with suspicion or fear, but with recognition. The kind a man might get after surviving a storm others only read about. Mayor Gladden approached with a ceremonial key carved from local pine. It wasn't official, just symbolic, but that was enough for Silver Ridge. For the man who helped rebuild what we almost let die, Gladden said, handing over the key. Deputy Thomas Bridger. Applause broke out, tentative at first, then rising. Tex didn't smile. He just lowered his head, touched the brim of his hat, and whispered, "Thank you." Rosie tugged his hand. "Can we dance now?" Tex blinked. She pointed toward the town square, where a fiddler and a banjo player had started plucking out a tune. "It's a festival, ain't it?" He followed her, letting her lead, boots slow and heavy at first. He hadn't danced since his mama's wake. But Rosie was insistent, her feet light and brave and full of life. Before long, others joined in. A circle of joy formed around them, people who had once locked their doors, now holding hands. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, its last rays caught the glint of the badge on Tex's chest. He looked out over the town that had once exiled him, once feared him. They now called him Deputy Bridger. And Rosie, the girl who'd lost everything, had a father not by blood, but by choice. Later that night, as the fireflies blinked and the music softened, Helen stood beside Tex. They watched Rosie chase shadows with the other kids, laughter trailing behind her. "You ever think you'd get a second day?" Helen asked quietly. Tex looked at her, then down at his hands, scarred, burned, healed. "No," he said, "but I'm glad I did." She touched his arm gently. "What'll you do tomorrow?" He tilted his head. "Start building the next day." Off in the distance, riders approached, not hostile, not angry, just curious. Outsiders, drawn by the tale of the giant cowboy and the girl who tamed him. One carried a camera, another wore a journalist's hat. They dismounted slowly, respectfully. "You Tex Bridger?" one asked. Tex nodded. "We heard this town forgave a monster, and that a little girl named Rosie saved a man's soul." Rosie perked up. "That's me," Tex sighed, amused. "Guess we better get used to telling the story." Rosie looked up at him, eyes gleaming. "Or we can just keep writing the next one." He chuckled softly. "Yeah, one day at a time, and so Silver Ridge stood reborn, not from laws or firepower, but from the small, stubborn acts of kindness that refused to die. A little girl's courage, a broken man's redemption, a town's choice to believe in second chances. Outlaws still roamed the territories, wounds still festered in places far from here. But in this valley, on this day, hope wore a badge and carried a child on his shoulders. If you believe stories like this matter, stick around. Another tale is already riding in the dust. Subscribe to Western Legacy and join us when the sun rises again.